So this morning, I am beginning a new series called Extraordinary Jesus for Ordinary Times, Exploring the Gospel with St. Luke. It's a little play on words because the part of the church year, the part of the church calendar that we're in, I don't know if you've ever heard this term, is called Ordinary Time. On the historic calendar of the Christian church, everything that falls outside the great seasons of the church, like Eastertide, Christmastide, Lent, Advent, everything else that falls is called ordinary time. Not because it's ordinary compared to those things, like, well, it's just ordinary, the way we use the word. The word ordinal means a number or a sequence of numbers. So the reason they call it ordinary time is it has to do with, because what they do is, in between the great seasons of the church, all the Sundays are numbered. In fact, today we happen to actually technically be on the 5th Sunday of ordinary time in the church year. But when I thought about this series and what we would teach between now and Easter, I really felt led by the Lord to try to bring the gospel up and rub it up against our ordinary lives. To bring the way of Jesus and the message of Jesus, to kind of bring that and rub it up against our everyday lives. And I know when we say ordinary time or ordinary lives, I know that a lot of people probably look back at the last couple of years and they say, Pastor Fran, this is not an ordinary time. This is an extraordinary time. And I get that. Point taken. We've all had this wild political, pandemic, economic couple of years, and I think we're all pretty exhausted by it, and I hope we're moving back toward some greater normalcy. I think we all long for that. But on the other hand, I think there's a sense in which the issues that we've faced and the temptations we've struggled with in this last couple of years are the same things which are always coming our way and tossing human beings around. It's just that for the last couple of years, we've experienced those things on steroids, in larger quantity. I think that's made us more afraid, and it's made us more reactive. And when we're afraid and reactive, we need to hear the word of the God who is never afraid and reactive to our hearts. And the other thing is that some of these things, like pandemics and severe political divisions, they've been around in this measure before. They've just never been around in our lifetime. My generation, current generations, we haven't really experienced these things. And so they seem like, the worst that's ever happened. But while all those things are going on, the things that make it seem like an extraordinary time or an unusual time, all the normal questions still remain, right? Who are we? What are we doing here? What do our lives mean? How can we be made more whole? How can we find joy? How can we be people who make our relationships more whole and become people of actual love and those questions were there, and they're still there, and they're the questions that the gospel speaks to so profoundly. So we're going to let St. Luke take us on a walk with Jesus over the next couple of months, and Jesus is going to help us if our hearts are open. He's going to help us to see and hear some important things for our ordinary lives in these extraordinary times. So now, it helps to know some things about Luke among the four gospel writers, because there are some things about Luke and about his gospel that are unique. For example, Luke is not an eyewitness to the events of Jesus, but he's so steeped in the oral stories. The Gospels were the last thing written in the New Testament. All those letters Paul wrote, stuff, that all came first. They told the stories orally, and later in the first century, they said, we better write this stuff down. These guys were all getting old, and they said, we better write this stuff down. And so Luke was not an eyewitness, but he was so steeped in all these things that his gospel actually ended up being the longest gospel. He collected such a collection of these stories about Jesus. And of course, he was the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. We discover that in the book of Acts, which is the other book that Luke wrote, right? The book of Acts. And so that's why, those stories of the spread of the gospel in the early church in the book of Acts, that's why they're given to us in such detail, because Luke was there, experiencing all of those things. Secondly, and very interestingly, Luke is the only Gentile, non-Jewish, He's the only Gentile contributor to the entire New Testament, which I think is fascinating. It gives him a different vantage point. So here's just a good example. Is it any wonder, being the only Gentile writer of the New Testament, that only Luke gives us the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Which is about a non-Jew, right? Living out the love of God. Also, Luke is the only one of the gospel writers who is a native Greek speaker. The New Testament's written in Greek, but he's the only one of all the New Testament writers whose first language was Greek. And so he actually uses a couple hundred words in his gospel that nobody else in the New Testament uses. Well, he's a doctor, too, and he's educated. So he has this extensive vocabulary. Greek's his first language. So he tells his stories with great detail and great precision. It's also interesting that Luke tends to look through the lenses of Jesus' humanity more than the other writers, which gives the Gospel of Luke a very interesting, different little bent or flavor, especially compared to John. If you know John's Gospel, John looks almost exclusively through the lenses of the divinity of Jesus, right? John starts out, says, this is the Word that was with God in the beginning and came down. This is the divine. Luke tells the story more from the human perspective. So, for example, he's the only one who records the detail that Jesus experienced what physicians call hematosis, that he sweated drops of blood when he was in the garden praying before his arrest. He gives us these windows into the humanity, in that case, the human anguish of Jesus. And I also just love the way Luke starts his gospel. Luke starts his gospel, he addresses it to someone named Theophilus. It reads like this. He says, Luke 1, verse 1, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to put in order a narrative of these things that have happened among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered those things to us, it seemed good to me also," Luke says, "it seemed good to me also, having had a complete understanding of all these things, to write for you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." It could be a proper name, Theophilus. It could be a person, but it's probably a literary device, because what the name means is lover of God. And it's probable that for Luke, the reason he tells us all these stories and the way he tells them is he knows that to see Jesus, to really perceive Jesus, is to fall in love with Jesus, and therefore to fall in love with God. And so it's like he's saying to all of us, all these stories I've written, these are for you, lovers of God, so that you may know all the details about these things. Luke also gives us the most detailed account of the birth of Christ and the events surrounding the birth of Jesus, but we just had Christmas, so I'm not going to start there. This morning, I'm going to begin with the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness in Luke chapter 4, which reads this way. "Then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan River. He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he was tempted by the devil for 40 days. And he ate nothing at all during that time and became very hungry. And then the devil said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become a loaf of bread.' But Jesus said, 'No, the Scriptures say, people do not live by bread alone.' Then the devil took him up and revealed to him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And he said, 'I will give you the glory of these kingdoms and all the authority over them, because they are mine to give to anyone I please, and I will give it all to you if you will bow down before me.' Jesus replied and said, 'The Scriptures say you must worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve.' And then the devil took him to Jerusalem, to the highest point of the temple, and said, 'If you are the Son of God, jump off. For the Scriptures say, he will order his angels to protect and guard you.'" Now Satan is quoting Scripture to Jesus. "And they will hold you up with their hands so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone." And Jesus responded and said, "The Scriptures also say you must not test the Lord your God." And when the devil had finished tempting Jesus, he left him until the next opportunity. So Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan River. And then he goes out in the desert to fast. And at the end of that time, the Satan comes to him to negotiate. There was this tradition among the Hebrew prophets of going out into the desert. They would go out into the desert to seek God. And so it seems that Jesus, when he's about to begin what we sometimes call his public ministry, he's going to go out, start to go village to village and preach that the kingdom is near and that there's this opportunity to change and for things to be different. But first he goes out in the desert, presumably to center himself in the Spirit of God, to center himself in the Father's truth and love. Paul later takes up that same tradition, by the way, of the Hebrew prophets. If you know the story of the Apostle Paul, who was out hunting and killing Christians, and that story of him encountering Jesus on the Damascus Road and being knocked off his horse and blinded and led into the city, and he has this whole conversation, where the Lord says to him, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And I love Paul's answer. He says, who are you, Lord? Like, I'm confused. And the Lord says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And so for Paul, right, Jesus can't be the Messiah. He was executed. God doesn't come down here and get executed. It doesn't make any sense. God's the strong one, not the weak one. He can't get in. And so he goes out. Paul tells us he went out in the desert for 3 years after that Damascus experience to sort out, to rethink pretty much everything. Now, Luke and Matthew, they put the temptations in different orders, probably just a result of stories being told orally, but they put them in different orders, but they both position this temptation to turn the stones into bread. They both have that as the first of the temptations, and Luke positions it in relationship to Jesus' hunger. Jesus was hungry after 40 days, and the devil came to him and said, hey, why don't you turn this stone into bread? But the other two temptations are a little different. The offer of all the kingdoms of the world, that looks beyond like immediate hunger and thirst and fatigue. That's about something bigger. And the attempt to provoke Jesus to leap from the pinnacle of the temple at first glance is just kind of bizarre. So what is going on here? What are these temptations about? Well, I don't think it takes too much imagination or is too much of a stretch to see that each of these three things also represents kind of universal desires that we have or that could be temptations for us. It's easy to get focused on the need for bread. Today we call that finances. Do we have enough? Will we have enough? How much is enough? What could we do if we had more? I'll give you all the kingdoms. Power is good. Right? I mean, most of us have fallen for the temptation to want to be more important, to be somebody, and we've fallen for the temptation to exercise power over other people. I would say that's probably true in every marriage just about at some point, unless somebody is really, the one who always lays down in a marriage. We've all fallen for the temptation to exercise power over the people, to choose to push someone or coerce someone or make someone go this way or that way, as opposed to trying to figure out a more respectful way of getting where we think things need to go. It calls to mind Jesus' words when Jesus said to the disciples, you know how it is out there in the world, that they lord it over each other. And then he says to the disciples, but it shall not be so with you. This is the question of power. Or the temptation to look at God and say, hey, I need a miracle here. I may have been dumb enough to jump off the temple or whatever stupid thing Fran Lehman did this week, but now you need to fix it. I mean, if God isn't going to go around waving whatever big magic wand he's got on my behalf, well, what good is he, right? I mean, come on, there's things that need fixing. I need something dramatic here. And I'll tell you, sometimes I've gotten myself into some really big messes in life. In most arenas of my life, actually, and in my marriage and in my finances and in my relationships, all kinds of things. And sometimes God has been really, he has come in and he's fixed it, or he's helped me figure out how to fix it, or he's made the consequences turn out to be, have you ever had that experience where you thought, oh, the consequences of this are going to be bad, and then they actually don't turn out quite as bad as you thought. And whenever that happens, I always think, that's not because I deserved it, because I was dumb. I jumped off the pinnacle of the temple, right? I did something stupid. And God was gracious to me. So often, God has been gracious to me. So yes, in various senses, I think these are universal temptations. Satan brings them to Jesus and tries to tempt him with these things. We are tempted with these things. But it wasn't until I was reading the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky a number of years ago that something else about these temptations opened up to me. And it comes from a little part of this story. But anyway, in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov, one of the characters in the novel actually creates this whole fictional story about Christ coming back during the Middle Ages, coming back to Spain, to the city of Seville, at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. This is this fictional story that one of the brothers creates in Dostoevsky's novel. And Christ, in this story, comes back to Spain at the height of the Spanish Inquisition, when the Catholic Church is imprisoning and executing people right and left for heresy. And people are obedient to the church and living in fear of the church. And in the story, Christ, who comes back looking like a regular person, just like he did the first time around, in the story, he raises a little girl from the dead on the steps of the church in Seville. It's her funeral. And as Jesus makes his way through the crowd, people are like, it's probably how it was, right? I mean, there's like something about Jesus. It's not like the paintings where there's this, round halo around his head, but people can like feel the goodness coming off him, and people are kind of like, and then he raises this little girl from the dead, and people start to say, what they know is the church, right? But they start to say, it's him. And people begin to weep, and people begin to bow down. They begin to feel the goodness and the love that's emanating from Jesus. And the Grand Inquisitor of the Inquisition has Jesus arrested and locked in a dungeon cell. And then that night, he comes to interrogate Jesus. And it's a fascinating tale. If you ever have the chance to read it, you can actually buy it just as this little piece. You don't have to read the 800-page novel. You can buy the Grand Inquisitor as a little piece. And so he comes to interrogate Jesus. And one of the fascinating elements, until I got to the end of reading it, I didn't even realize it. It's kind of like, what was that movie where everybody's dead, but you didn't know it till the end, right? Sixth Sense, right? So it's kind of like that. So you read this whole story, and the whole story feels like there's this conversation going on between the Grand Inquisitor and Jesus. And at the very end, you realize Jesus has never spoken. Kind of like what Isaiah said about Jesus' arrest and trial and crucifixion. Isaiah said, as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus never speaks. And yet there's this whole thing that unfolds. And the Inquisitor wants to know. He's asking Jesus, why have you returned? There's nothing here for you. Referring to the church, and I'm paraphrasing their long conversation, he says this. They, meaning the people, he says, they belong to us. We give them what they need. Yes, they are in fear and bondage to us, to the church. He says they are in fear and bondage to us, but we tell them what to do. We tell them what God requires, and that's what they want. They don't want the freedom you offer them, a freedom that requires them to actually face their hearts and see something new and change. It's too big a burden. They don't want that freedom, so we offer them slavery, and they thank us for it. It's a very telling description of religion, even Christian religion at its worst. Right? Because even Christian religion in so many of its forms and at its worst, and I could go off on this for a long time, does not open up our hearts to God and make new people out of us. It says, here is the God who has, the tyrant God who has created the Christian religion, and here are all the things it requires, and your job is to bow down. That doesn't make anybody new, and it doesn't make anybody free. Yes, we make slaves of them, and they thank us for it. And at one point, the inquisitor, who as the story unfolds, you begin to realize is really Satan himself. At one point, the inquisitor takes Jesus back to that day in the wilderness here in Luke 4, right? Because he was there with Jesus. And he basically says to Jesus, you should have taken the deals that I offered you back there. Because your way, the way of love, will never, ever, ever work. You think you're going to win these people back by love? He says, I offered you better ways to get them back. You should have taken the deal. And one of the most telling lines, and this is when it clicked for me, all this thinking about the temptations. One of the most telling lines is what the inquisitor says to Jesus about turning stones into bread. He says this, if you would have offered them bread, they would have come trotting after you like a flock. You want to win these people? And it reminds me of that story in John 6, if you've ever read John's gospel. It's exactly what happens. Right? The feeding of the multitudes, and Jesus feeds everybody, and then he disappears to the other side of the lake, and the next day they spend half the night getting around the lake, and they find Jesus, hey, got more bread? The enemy says, if you would have given them bread, man, they would have come trotting after you like a flock. And when I read that line, it was like blow my mind, as our Haitian friends say, tête chargée, blew up my mind. Yes, Jesus was hungry. Turning stones, there's so much more going on there. If you feed them materially, they'll keep coming after you. They'll have allegiance to you. They'll keep trotting after you because you're the sugar daddy. Or what is it to have the kingdoms? What does Satan say? All this authority I will give to you. Authority is not an invitation. Satan is saying, you don't have to win them back like with love. You can force them back. The way every tyrant in the world rules, and the New Testament would argue that every tyrant ruler in the world is really an agent of Satan, because that's the way Satan does things. And he says, you don't have to win them back. You can rule them the way I rule them, and I'll give it to you. Problem is, what we know in Christ is this is not how God's doing it. Or what would happen, for example, with the temple courts packed with people if you did a swan dive off the pinnacle of the temple and then 6 inches from the ground the Lord caught you? Everybody would be like that scene in Oh Brother when John Goodman catches the flag, right? The Confederate flag. Everybody would be like, whoa. And then they'd bow down because, hey, well, if you can dive off the temple and stop 6 inches off the ground, you obviously are in charge. What Satan was offering Jesus in the desert were alternative ways to save the world. Give them bread. Give them stuff. Don't try to win them back with love. Make them bow down. Do such feats in front of them that they have no choice but to fall on their faces. But here's what you have to see. All those ways run counter to the heart of God and the way that he has chosen to save the world, which is that the creatures are free and love must be chosen. Creatures are free. There's a whole bunch of Christian theologies even out there, by the way. This is kind of an aside that say the creatures aren't free. A lot of the hardcore predestination theologies and stuff, that's just a violation of everything about Jesus. The creatures are free and love must be chosen. God is love. God has chosen love. Can the world be saved by love? Maybe it's a fool's errand, as they say. Because that's certainly what Satan was saying is, you think you're going to save the world by love when people want all these other things, when they want all these other shortcuts to get what they think they want? It's never going to happen. Could Jesus have been tempted by these other ways to get human beings back into obedience to God? I don't know. Love is the hardest thing. I mean, you might look at those feats, ruling the world, you might say that's a hard thing, or leaping off the temple and hoping God catches you, that's a hard thing. But love is actually the hardest thing. I think of Jesus in the garden praying, Father, if there's any other way, right? He was offered these three other ways. If there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. Now, here's the question that I think where it gets kind of interesting. If Jesus was offered these alternative ways to wrangle human beings back into obedience to God, that was all God was after, and not after freely given love. If Jesus was offered these alternative ways, and we're tempted by these alternative ways, what do you think the odds are that we would be tempted, now that we have this Christian faith, to twist this Christian faith in those directions? I'd say the odds are probably pretty high. Stones into bread. In modern times, the prosperity gospel comes to mind. If you follow Jesus, you'll prosper. He'll bless you with money and stuff and the American dream. If you offer them nice cars and fat bank accounts, they will come trotting after you like a flock. It's not that God doesn't bless us. It's not that God doesn't help us. It's not that He's not involved in our material lives. But you better not twist the gospel into that. And if not the prosperity gospel per se, at least the promise that you'll never have material struggles. I've had a lot of Christians come to me as a pastor over the years and say, Pastor, I became a Christian. I didn't think I was going to have these problems anymore. And I lost my job. I'm broke. I'm struggling to pay my rent or my mortgage. These things aren't supposed to happen. That's not what the Apostle Paul said. The Apostle Paul said, I've learned what it is to be content in Christ when I've got plenty and when I'm in want, when I'm hungry and when I'm well fed. Life is full of ups and downs, but we have turned the gospel sometimes, turned the Christian faith into, God's going to turn all these stones into a constant stream of bread for you. I will give you all authority if you will, all you have to do is bow down to me. This may actually be in some ways the most relevant or one of the most relevant of these temptations for Christians at the present moment. Over the last 50 years or so, Christians have been offered political power in our country by a whole succession of politicians. And Christians have begun to think that the prime directive of the Christian faith is to restore what they perceive to be Christian values to America, or a Christianized America, or a Christian America that once was, which in my mind is a bit of a fiction. That's the word I wanted. Because when we look back, we see that our country was also at the same time permeated by many things, broadly, culturally speaking, that weren't Christian. I mean, genocide of Native Americans, millions of, African slaves. We look back, we say, the great Christian era, we got to get back to this Christian era. But anyway, that's been kind of the fantasy that's been and so Christians have been kind of offered increasing political power. And 50 years into that trajectory has alienated far more people from the Christian faith than it has attracted or converted people to the Christian faith. Just look at the last couple of years, article after article after article in major journals and newspapers and magazines, and basically saying, what's with the Christians? While the Christians are like, we want the political power, and we're gonna do this, and back in 2016 when the presidential election was going on, and one of the presidential candidates was heavily courting the Christian community. That's not an overstatement. Speaking at the Christian universities, speaking in mega churches, and offering Christians a very big seat at the political table if he won. And this is not about that candidate. I want you to hear this story. And in the middle of all that, the TV evangelist Pat Robertson, if you know who that is, made this public statement looking at all the power that Christians were about to be handed in the political realm, so he thought. He made this statement. He said, pretty soon we Christians, pretty soon we're going to be running the place, meaning running America. Do you hear it? I'll give you all the authority. We're going to be running the place, and we're going to tell everybody what to do, and we're going to have all that power. Here's the problem. God is not redeeming. Don't get hung up on political stuff. This is an illustration. God is not redeeming the world by us running the place. God is redeeming the world by love through Jesus Christ, and he has invited us to participate by loving the place, by loving the people. This is how they will know that you are my disciples. This is how they will know you are of my kingdom, that you have this love. And it's not just in like political realm, it's in our personal lives too. We often choose in our personal lives power over love, right? Jesus says, I'm going to have my love dwell in you. Now you guys go love people. I had lots, I don't think any of my siblings, I have 4 siblings, I don't think any of them listen to my sermons, so I can say this. Because I was in California. By the way, thank you for letting me be gone to my mom's this week and see my mom and work on her house and all that stuff. But, there's a lot of dysfunction with my siblings. And my job in my family is to love each of them the very best I can. I cannot force, because they're free creatures, right? Cannot force or compel them to be reconciled to one another, to deal with the bitterness they have in their hearts toward one another. I mean, I'm good with everybody, but everybody's not so good with each other. And so, but we're so often tempted, because when you just choose to love, you're not in control of the outcome, right? Somebody's really angry at you and you decide to try to figure out how to live love back toward them. You're not in control of the outcome. They might still hate you. They might still want to beat the snot out of you. And you're thinking, well, I want to love them. I want to try to love them. You're not in control of the outcome, but that is the thing. And so the temptation, when we can't control the outcome, is to reach for power. To say, well, I'm going to make so-and-so do this. I'm going to push so-and-so to do this. I'm going to argue with this person, and I'm going to shame them, and then they're going to do what I want them to do. So even in our personal lives, there's this temptation to say, we've got to get this done by power. It's that thing, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says, you look at the cross and you say, that's all weakness. Paul says, no, that's the most powerful thing there is in the world. That's love. That's the most powerful thing that there is. Stones into bread, I'll give you all the authority. Throw yourself off the temple and give them a miracle. This to me is the Christianity that almost exclusively thinks about God in terms of the things God needs to be doing to fix our problems or enhance our lives, like blessing our checkbooks, healing our bodies. I like both of those, by the way. Like my checkbook to be blessed and my body to be whole. Changing our spouse's heart, right? Like God, it's like that old, Bill Cosby. Probably bad to bring up Bill Cosby in church, isn't it? But when I was a kid, we also used to listen to those Bill Cosby records, and the one about Noah, where he brings all the animals in the ark, and then God says like, well, you got 2 males there of that species, and Cosby's tired and he's frustrated, or Noah's tired and he's frustrated, and he says, well, you change one of them. And sometimes we're like that with our spouse. We say, well, I don't want to do the hard work of changing me, God. Change my spouse. She's wrong. He's wrong. You do it. You work your miracle thing and just make it better. Or show my friend why they're wrong, or maybe even help me get that new car I want in the color that I really, really want. And here's probably the biggest one where we apply this kind of thinking, is we so often want God to work out the issues in our souls by zapping us, rather than making us go through some kind of belabored and slowly transforming process of spiritual growth. I have a charismatic background in church. If you know, Catholic, then charismatic, then whatever this is. And so that's how I describe us now. Whatever this is, we're hanging out with Jesus. So, but I have a charismatic background, right? So I believe in the Holy Spirit and the power and the miracles and the gifts and all that kind of stuff, right? Understood in a healthy way. But this is the thinking that you often see in charismatic circles. And I cannot tell you how many times in communities of charismatic Christians, and even at times in our own church in years past, somebody's got this, you have a person who has these deep struggles, right? Struggles go all the way back to their childhood. They've been wounded. They've become bitter or fearful. They believe, like I was saying this right, I am who you say I am. They believe all these lies about themselves, right? And then we say, well, we're going to fix this person by just going, bam, and you're going to be fixed. Well, it might work that way once in a while, but you know what it takes most of the time? A journey. Your heart opens up, God comes in and does his work, and you see new things, and God in his own mysterious way, heals those wounds, and you get a different vision of life, and God begins to tell you who and what you really are, and you start to try to take hold of those truths that you're not all this junk everybody said. You're this better thing that God says what you are, you know. But we like the idea of just, you know, throw ourselves off the temple and, you know, God will do it like that, and that'll be that. Okay, so here's what I think. I think if you want a profound Christianity, there's something that you have to see about all of these temptations. They all avoid something. They all avoid the question of love, right? Stones into bread, give you all the authority, zap, make it all better. All avoid the deeper question of love. They all focus on how things are going, not who we're becoming. They all see our great needs as something out here, not something in here. And they all focus on what God is going to do for you, not who He is going to be in you or what He is going to do in you. And, are you ready for this? They're all individually focused. Your power, your bread, your miracle. When the truth is that God is trying to reconcile by His love all things, all people. Right? God's always trying to reconcile. This is the whole message of the New Testament. And Christ has reconciled us to the Father. Anybody know the rest of this in 2 Corinthians 5? And He has given to us the what? The message of reconciliation, right? It's not just my power and my bread and my miracles. It's the reconciliation of everything and specifically of everybody. Good morning, George. Liz. We're still waiting, aren't we, for the whole world to get it. We're still killing each other as human beings. And all these temptations, which we then morph kind of our Christianity into the shape of these things, they get their eyes off of that. They get their eyes off of the great restoration, the idea that someday all of us as human beings, how does Revelation say it? Every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, and color, and rich, and poor, and short, and tall, a little bit chubby, really skinny, all going to be at the table together, all reconciled, all living in the gloriousness of love. So, here's what I would say to you this morning. God isn't offering you just blessings. There are those, or worldly power, or quick fixes. He's offering you relationship. Jesus answered and said to him, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him." I almost cry when I read this these days. And we will come to Him and make our home with Him. And that's salvation. And if someone is selling you a Christianity that's less than something beautiful, something with love at the center, something that's going to transform you and make you new, if someone's selling you a Christianity that's less than that, that looks like any of these other things, send it back. Like Elvis sang, remember? Return to sender, address on... I did a funeral 3 weeks ago where all the music was Elvis music. I loved it. Thought it was awesome. But seriously, this is... all that other stuff, it takes us off track. And I think we're living in a time when some Christians, and I think this church is among them, we are among them, are waking up. We're coming back to the thing in our time Jesus came to bring to us. Heart of the matter, which is the love of God invading human hearts and restoring and changing us so that then also this can all be restored and changed. Because the journey God is inviting you to is one where love comes to awaken you and heal you and deepen you and bring you joy and to flow through you. It's really good news. Let's pray. What is there to pray, Lord? I want to pray. I want to sit at your feet and hear you speak to me, and I want you to sing your songs over us together. I want you to sing your songs over us, Lord, until each of us is alive in you and until all of us are dancing together with you. There is no one like you. None like you. We are grateful. Maybe if I were to pray anything for each of us and all of us this morning, Lord, I would say, take us on a journey. Take us places we haven't been. Just when we thought we figured it out, we saw the whole picture, take us somewhere beyond that. Thinking about my friend Larry standing up here behind me this morning, the pilot. We all think we've seen the sunrise, and then Larry tells me about being up above the clouds and watching the sun rise and rise and rise and rise. Take us on that kind of journey, Lord. Thank you for your love.